Good afternoon. My name is Vishal Singh. I'm an associate professor at the Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore, where my group looks at innovation and management of property, architecture, and construction technologies for impact. And the way we go about doing so is by looking at cognition, computing, and design. And in this paper as well, we do the same. We look at them from a cognitive point of view, asking the question, how do we critically think about BIM research and practice? And as you'll see, this is the right time to do so because we have now years of experience both in terms of BIM research as well as BIM practice. So if we look at BIM research over the years, we can broadly classify it into two parts. So you have the pre-commercial BIM, when we did not have the BIM terminology, and neither did we have the commercial BIM applications. And this was the phase from mid-1970s to late 1990s. And then from 2000 onward, we have had BIM applications in practice. And we'll see that the patterns of research in these two phases have been fairly distinct. And now we are in a phase where there are talks about what's beyond BIM, and probably it's the right time then to ask what are the theoretical foundations to take forward. When you ask this question, often points are raised that we are largely in applied research, but applied research also needs a strong theoretical foundation. So let's look at the theoretical differences between the two phases so far. So in the pre-BIM era, when people were working towards what we now know as BIM applications, there were a lot of diverse theoretical approaches that were explored. People looked at database theories, ontologies, product data modeling, different aspects of geometric modeling, knowledge-based systems, programming language theories, abstraction principles, and so on. Whereas from 2000 onwards, the research has largely been applied research. While some work continued with product data model and standards, most of the work has been about application development, case studies and pilots, looking at BIM ecosystem, which is looking at products, processes, people, and policies, how they interconnect, execution plans and implementation plans, and work on aspects such as BIM and lean, BIM and sustainability, BIM and green. Not much of theoretical work besides some work on BIM ecosystem. So as such, there was opportunity to build reflective theories, reflective models of BIM applications, and understanding how they function, and using abductive theory. But this is what we intend to do by looking at it from a BIM thinking perspective, hoping that that will be useful going forward. So before we go any further, let's look at another example just to iterate the point that applied work also needs strong theoretical foundations. So here is an example of three different applications which do not look related to each other, besides the color probably. Probably these are designed and developed by people who did not have much theoretical foundations. But if we look closely, if we want to understand them better, each of these is a case of lever design. So if somebody has a good understanding of how a lever works, so you have a fulcrum, you apply a force at a point and you produce a force at another point. That helps in looking at the applications and the tools itself, and we can design them better. So the analogy is very similar here. With BIM thinking, that's what we want to achieve. We want to understand what are the fundamental objectives and characteristics of BIM applications independent of any particular use case. And this is what I would like to achieve. So how do we go about it? So the research, what we do, because as stated, we are looking at reflections from experience. So we look at the literature of the last 20 years, and this vast amount of literature which has discussed benefits of BIM, use cases, and there are guidelines and execution plans. There has been, in recent years, a lot of comprehensive literature review, including use of techniques like latent semantic analysis, scientometric analysis. And then, of course, we have a lot of keywords identified. There are BIM definitions, there are roadmaps. So there's a lot of keywords to start putting them together. And that's what we did. We got those keywords together and started to group them to sort of identify the clusters of objectives and characteristics that can be identified. And once we found those fundamental objectives and characteristics, thereafter additional keywords were classified to see whether they fit in each of these or not. Of course, this process also included validation with discussions with experts, with doctoral students, with faculties, and of course, we can continue the iteration further. But based on the findings so far, we have identified 8 fundamental objectives and characteristics of BIM, which include representation, documentation, automation. Automation can be seen to be automatically there in BIM applications. For instance, when you think of intelligent documentation, it already has automation in there. And of course, one of the objectives is that BIM application should facilitate automation in the construction process. And then we have knowledge and information management. So some people call BIM as building information management, and that explains this perspective as well. Then one of the objectives of using BIM applications is to help different kinds of decisions we make, whether it's through analysis, whether it's through simulation, or some other form. But decision support is one of the fundamental objectives. Then we have standardization, we have transaction and exchange. So it's not just transaction and exchange between BIM applications, but also transaction and exchange between users and applications, as well as BIM as a collaborative tool that helps transaction and exchange between the users. And then we have BIM applications, a part of a larger ecosystem, both within BIM applications, but also between the larger construction ecosystem. So to support that ecosystem is also one of the objectives. So the distribution shown here is essentially how the keywords are identified in these sources spread out across these keywords. We won't go into the distribution pattern itself. I think that needs a separate discussion. So before we go any further, let's look at another case example. So what we did was we also looked at those objectives and reflected on some of the projects we have done to see whether we can find these objectives and characteristics applicable to these case examples. So here's an example of PhD thesis project that started in 2013 and which finally led to a startup called VisualLink. So initially the PhD started with the focus on BIM for facilities management, and once we initially gathered the requirements, one of the key requirements was a 3D navigation with the goal that users can navigate the objects, find the objects and query and find the information. But as we progressed, we realized that requirement was driven from somebody with a design background, but that doesn't necessarily fit with people from facilities management, even though the industry partners were also related to facilities management. So as we moved in the research, we recognized and changed several aspects of the application, but largely the findings were that the 3D first approach was misleading. We found several challenges with standardization, not just in terms of tools and applications, but also in terms of processes. There were challenges because the companies and organizations did not have a knowledge management practice. It was quite messy, and hence it was difficult to streamline the use of these sort of applications within their practice as well. Transactions and exchanges were patchy, not just within the application, but also with the users. Then, of course, there were other challenges with respect to the ecosystem, lots of dependencies there. We are currently in a stage where there is some automation and a large amount of manual processes. So this interface also creates problems. And then we have challenges with documentation in the operational stage. Overall, BIM at the moment supports only some of the decision-making processes that is desirable. So all the 8 fundamental objectives and characteristics that we have identified were applicable to this case study as well as to the other case studies as well. So now that we have identified these 8 fundamental objectives and characteristics, how do we proceed with them? How do we actually use them? So the proposal here is that we can start by asking these 6 questions. So the 5 W's and 1 H for each of these characteristics. For example, who is going to produce the representation and who is going to consume the representation? Why is the representation being produced? What is going to be there and what is not going to be there in the representation? Where is it going to be produced and where is it going to be consumed? When is it going to be produced and when is it going to be consumed? How is it going to be produced and how is it going to be consumed, and so on. So we can start by asking these questions, and hopefully that will help us critically think about how BIM applies to a particular context. And before we close, one of the things to account for, and that's important, is to recognize that so far most of the development of BIM has been with the focus of human users. But as we go forward, when we have more automation and more intelligence in machines, we are not only going to be working with humans, but also as a network of human and non-human actors. So all these questions need to be posed with respect to humans as well as non-human actors, both as producers as well as consumers. And with that, I'll stop here, and I'll be happy to take more questions.